I think we might kick off. For those who don't know me, I'm Renee Famiati. I'm a researcher at the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University. And this is our research and practice seminar series. This is the second one we've done because the first couple were interrupted, and our first one we've done online, which actually I think is super great because I can see lots of colleagues from all over the world who are able to Zoom in and join us. Yes, so today we have Dr Kiran Pienaar, who's a lecturer at the moment at the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society. She wasn't here at my own research centre when I invited her, but now is here. Her research explores connections between health, gender, sexuality and the body, with a particular interest in drug consumption and sexual cultures and the socio-political dimensions of health. And so today, as you can see, she's going to be talking about drugs as technologies of the self, consuming drugs, remaking gender and sexuality in LGBTQ cultures. I think Kiran's going to be speaking for about 40 minutes, and I'd encourage you to use the Q&A function down the bottom of the webinar. If you have any questions going along, you can put it in there, or you can save it at the end because we'll have some question time at the end, which I'll facilitate. But yeah, we'll be pretty relaxed, and I'm sure Kiran's happy to answer anything at the end. So I'm going to hand it over to her now, and I'm going to get rid of my face and hand over the screen to you, Kiran.
Thank you, Renee. And thank you for that kind introduction, and to you all for Zooming in. It's great to see the interest that the seminar has attracted. I'd like to start by acknowledging that this presentation takes place on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And this is my first Zoom presentation for those of you who Zoomed in a bit earlier. And it's both Renee and my first experience with the webinar functionality. And we've spent quite a bit of time preemptively troubleshooting, so we hope it all goes smoothly on the technical front. But we'd ask you to please be patient with any technical challenges that we might face as we get used to this new normal. But fingers crossed that we don't experience any. So as Renee mentioned, my presentation today is titled Drugs as Technologies of the Self, Consuming Drugs, Remaking Gender and Sexuality in LGBTQ Cultures. And it draws on data from a larger ARC-funded discovery project called Chemical Practices, Enhancement and Experimentation. And briefly, the project explores drug consumption among sexual and gender diverse minorities, focusing on how they use drugs to transform or enhance the experience of gender, sex and sexuality. Just to begin with some important acknowledgements, and to give you a sense of the team of people behind this research and the organizations and individuals who have supported it. And it really has been a collective endeavor. So first up, thanks to our participants for sharing their experiences. As you'll see shortly, they shared some very intimate details of their lives with exceptional candor. And without them, this research would not be possible. As I mentioned, the study was funded by an ARC Discovery Grant, and it also benefited from the support of the University of Sydney and Monash University, where I was based before joining La Trobe. And the presentation is based on a co-authored paper with my colleagues on the project, Kane Race and Dean Murphy, and Dean is here Zooming in with us today, both based at the University of Sydney, and Toby Lee at the University of New South Wales. Many of the Victorian interviews that we quote in the presentation were conducted by David Vikalis, our research assistant at Monash. And I've also included a link to our project website in case any of you would like to find out more about the study that we're presenting on today. It'll also be at the end of the presentation. Many individuals and organizations, as I mentioned, have supported this research in various ways, and we've benefited from the insights and guidance of an advisory group who are listed here. And finally, we're grateful for the assistance of local LGBTQ organizations in New South Wales and Victoria. They assisted us with our recruitment efforts, and we're very grateful for their support. As I mentioned, the presentation draws on a recently published article in the International Journal of Drug Policy. I've included the details and a link here, and I'd be happy to pass on a copy to anyone who's interested or who may not be able to access it. Unfortunately, it is behind a paywall. So just to start with some background, as I'm sure you all know, the consumption of drugs has long been a mainstay of urban queer cultures. Yet despite this, there have been surprisingly few qualitative studies exploring the gender and sexual dynamics of drug use in queer communities, with some notable exceptions, including the work of colleagues here at ARCSHS, the work of Kane Race, who's a CI on this project, Jamie Hakim, Christian Moller, Paul Preciado. Those are a few exceptions. And our study builds on this important work. But I should add that barring these few exceptions, much of the research that does exist in this area tends to frame queer drug consumption as a pathology or a problem. For example, it characterizes the consumption of illicit drugs among LGBTQ people as significantly higher and presenting greater risk than consumption among cisgender heterosexual people. The focus on risky, so-called problematic behavior may, of course, be motivated by well-meaning efforts to help those in need of support and treatment. However, in their efforts to explain queer drug use, these accounts tend to conceive it as a response to stigma, trauma, marginalisation, and the increased prevalence of mental health issues in LGBTQ populations. And we suggest that queer drug use is not so easily reducible to tropes of pathology, stigma, and marginality. And when it is explained in these terms, the complexity and diversity of LGBTQ people's experiences gets routinely overlooked. And as one of our participants, Ursula, a 25-year-old lesbian woman, put it, if I could give service providers one piece of advice as a queer person, it would be, don't assume that trauma and drug use are related for all gay people. Each person's life and experiences are going to be different. So responding to Ursula's insight and more generally to the openings in the literature, our project aims to generate much needed new insights into the dynamics of drug use among LGBTQ people. And it explores, and I'm going to try and condense our aims into two, it explores how LGBTQ people experience and give meaning to drug consumption. And I should just note here that we're interested in both licit and illicit drugs, as one of the aims of the project is to consider, interrogate, and trouble the distinction between licit and illicit drugs. So we haven't limited our focus on illicit drugs, as is often the case. We're also interested in how LGBTQ people pursue particular drug effects to transform their experience of gender and or sexuality. So turning now to a few comments on the theoretical approach that informs this study. Our conception of drugs and their effects, and I use that term advisedly, is informed by concepts from science and technology studies, post-humanisms, and new materialisms. It is also inspired by and builds on the burgeoning critical drugs literature to which many of the colleagues at ARCSHS here and elsewhere have made seminal contributions. And this will be familiar to many of you here, so I won't labor the point, but just briefly, this work challenges the commonplace view of drugs as stable entities with intrinsic properties that generate predictable effects. That's the commonplace view of drugs, a kind of pharmacological approach. Instead, this body of work conceives the action of drugs and their purported effects as produced in relation to various other actors, contexts, and practices. So in the context of our study, these might include things like individual bodies, gender norms, sexual desires, specific locations, technology, smartphones, dating apps. Importantly, this understanding recognizes that drugs are not only consumed by individual subjects, but are active in shaping subjects. So applying this insight to queer cultures allows us to address the ways in which drugs help to produce gendered sexual subjects. And in the process, it produces or enables particular sexual practices, modes of intimacy, and gender expression. So as you can hopefully tell from this account, and just to put it in really simple terms, our project essentially takes what might be called a drug positive and sex positive approach to theorizing queer drug use. We've also drawn, in this paper in particular, on Foucault's 1988 theorization of technologies or techniques of the self to guide our analysis of the role of drugs in enhancing or transforming experiences of sex, sexuality, or gender. Foucault defines technologies of the self as the means by which, and I quote, individuals effect a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thought, conduct, and ways of being, so as to transform themselves, end quote. This approach has since been elaborated by Preciado in their 2018 and 2013 work, who describe pharmaceuticals, and again I quote, as a new set of technologies for producing sexual subjectivity, end quote. Preciado defines gender and sexuality as techniques of the body rather than self-evident categories. So in line with this account of the performativity of gender, sexuality, and drugs, our analytic approach embraces the possibility that drug consumption practices may be an important modality for enacting new subjectivities, particularly ones that depart from dominant disciplinary forms. And I guess here we're thinking of heteronormative gender binary forms of identity. And you'll see how that plays out. I'll go through some quotes and analyze some quotes from our interview data shortly. So the study as a whole comprised two components. This is just turning to our methods. In-depth qualitative interviews and a national online survey exploring the dynamics of drug use, gender, and sexuality. We're still in the process of analysing the survey data, and the presentation is based on the interview components. All members of the research team were involved in conducting the interviews, and although they were one-on-one, I should say, we conducted interviews with 42 self-identified LGBTQ participants in Victoria and New South Wales. They comprised people of diverse genders and sexualities, aged between 18 and 75. So as you can see, we got a good age range. Didn't expect to get quite to the top of that age range. All of our participants described ongoing use of a range of licit and illicit drugs. These included alcohol, antiretrovirals, cannabis, methamphetamine, MDMA, and hormones. In this presentation, much of the material I'll quote on describes their experiences with illicit drugs, but we're also working on analysing the material in relation to some of the illicit drugs. In particular, Dean is working on a paper on antiretrovirals. So just to give you, to kind of flag that, I suppose, at this point. I should also note that with the exception of a few regional participants, our data is drawn from a largely metropolitan sample. And it is worth noting that the intersections of drug consumption with LGBTQ identities may, of course, take different forms in regional contexts. Interviews were conducted in person, and they comprised a dual method approach, beginning with a mapping exercise, in which participants were asked to plot the substances they consume based on the frequency of consumption. And we've included an example here just to give you a sense of what it looked like. Essentially, the mapping exercise functioned as an elicitation technique to start the discussion. And then we often referred back to the map during the course of the interview. So participants were then asked a series of open-ended questions about their drug use and its relevance to their gendered and or sexual experience. They were asked what particular drugs do for them, so that's how the question was framed, rather than in terms of effects, and how they manage drug use to maximize benefits and minimize potential harms. So in this presentation, in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on two key themes related to the dynamics of drug consumption among sexual and gender diverse people. The first is sex on drugs, pleasure, intimacy, and enhancement. And the second is drugs in the making of gender. So turning now to the kind of the core or the heart of the presentation, I suppose. The first theme, sex, connection, and enhancement. Particularly valued for some LGBTQ consumers was the capacity of particular drugs to transform bodily experiences and the gender itself. This was especially striking for some trans and gender diverse participants who described how consuming their preferred drug or drugs allows them to experience their bodies in transformative ways that enable self-acceptance and enhance the experience of sex. A key theme in participants' accounts of sexualized drug use was the role of drugs in enhancing sex by amplifying pleasure and facilitating connection and intimacy. So, for example, Rihanna, a queer cis woman, described the effects of crystal meth in these terms. So the positive for me of smoking crystal is feeling like I've really connected with the person again. This is her partner, the person that I've chosen to be with and love. And on an intimate level for me, I think why I get really excited about smoking crystal is sexually for me, I feel like I actually get really connected with my partner after smoking crystal. I get experimental in the moment with this person. So I feel connected with her in that moment and I feel open. The centrality of pleasure and connection in participants' accounts is not surprising, given that the quest for pleasure and intimacy are key forces animating sex. However, while Rihanna attributes these effects to smoking crystal methamphetamine, Ursula makes a similar point about connection, but in reference to what she calls sex on drugs more generally. As she explains, sex on drugs just makes sex better. It's made sexual experiences better and emotional experiences where I'll be naked with someone and not necessarily had sex with them. It gives it a different level of how well you can connect with that other person, even if you're just talking shit on a mattress for 6 hours. And I am quoting verbatim, so you can see that our participants were wonderfully candid with us. Importantly, we're not suggesting here that sexual pleasure and connection can be attributed solely to the action of particular drugs. Rather, they materialize through the context in which drugs are consumed. So in relation to Ursula's account then, we can extrapolate that this context includes tactile and affective dimensions, such as the feeling of skin-to-skin contact, nakedness, attraction, and emotional rapport. It also includes non-human phenomena, such as a private space, the presence of a mattress, and the luxury of uninterrupted time. And at this point, I just want to note that while I was putting the presentation together, it struck me that these accounts from these two women who identify as queer, in one case and lesbian in the other, are also gendered in particular ways. And I want to go back and look at the data and see the extent to which the focus on connection and intimacy and the sense that drugs enhance that. I'm interested in the ways in which that's gendered in particular ways, because as you'll see from the next accounts that we look at from gay cis men, their experiences of drug use and the effects that they attribute to them are rather different. But inspired by, to return to Ursula's account, inspired by Bruno's concept of bodily architectures and Race's more recent account of intimate infrastructures, we refer to these infrastructural elements that facilitate intimate encounters as sexual architectures, the erotic relations, emotions, practices, spaces, and meanings that jointly constitute the sexual experience. Within this architecture, or these architectures in the plural, drugs play a performative, but importantly not determining role in the intensification of desire and arousal and sexual pleasure. So in other words, we're not suggesting that you can attribute any kind of linear effects to drugs or predictable effects, but rather that these effects are part of the kind of the context or assemblage in which drug use takes place. As Dane explains in relation to the effects of GHB, GHB makes the experience of sexual things like getting fucked or giving someone head or something a lot more intensely sexual. It's like amping the sexualness of it up. It's also a lot more arousing. It just makes you more aroused, I think. Like the touch or getting touched. I like it. I like taking it, especially in combination with the other drugs. Insofar as some drugs are experienced as promoting this inhibition and enhancing confidence, they enable sexual practices that might otherwise be uncomfortable, inaccessible, or even unthinkable. The disinhibitory effects of certain drugs were described as particularly important in relation to exploring sexuality outside the bounds of heteronormative expectations. So, for example, Fuego, that's always a tricky name to pronounce. Our participants chose their own pseudonyms, so some of them are a bit tricky to pronounce. Fuego, a 23-year-old pansexual gender diverse participant who grew up in a conservative community, describes the productive effects of alcohol in these terms. And they say, in terms of like sexuality and sex, I guess alcohol was originally sort of bound up with my exploration of my sexuality. Like, making out with boys and that sort of thing. Well, it wasn't necessarily dependent on alcohol, but that took away my inhibitions because I went to a Catholic high school and grew up in the country. And I don't know if I would say it was frowned upon, but that's the way it felt anyway in school. So like, it wasn't really easy for us to pursue things that sort of deviated from the norm. Here, Fuego describes the consumption of alcohol as a practice that has the potential to enable non-heteronormative forms of sexual expression. In addition to offering fairly general accounts of sexualized drug effects, participants also assigned unique capacities or effects to specific drugs. For example, the consumption of crystal can create what we've called, in other work, a sensuously dilated temporality, prolonging play sessions, and in some cases, extending them beyond the point of orgasm. This effect was prized by many of the gay cis men we interviewed, as the following account demonstrates. And this is Corey, a 59-year-old gay cis man. Corey says, crystal lengthens play sessions time-wise, definitely, yeah. And even if you do come, you still want to keep going and going. So you can quite easily go for 12 or 24 or 36 hours. If you do come, that doesn't make you stop and think, okay, now I'm going to make you a cup of tea and have a cigarette, if you know what I mean. You still want to keep going. So coming doesn't necessarily mean the end. Absolutely not. The capacity of crystal to delay ejaculation suggests that reaching orgasm is not the sole objective of the sexual encounters our participants describe. Indeed, what is valued in these exchanges exceeds a singular concern with orgasm as a teleological goal. Rather, it includes crystal's potential to engender an intense, resolute focus on various sexual possibilities and practices, along with the stamina needed to sustain these activities. And we have a range of quotes that illustrate this, but in the interest of time, I've just picked one. So, commenting on the sexual effects of their preferred drugs, some participants observed that consuming these drugs in sexual contexts increases their sexual confidence, performance, and prowess. It also enables particular sexual practices that might otherwise be uncomfortable or inaccessible. So Avery, a 31-year-old gay fluid cis man, makes this point with reference to the capacities of amyl and GHB. However, he stresses that while amyl in particular minimizes the discomfort he experiences during anal receptive sex, it's not a necessary precursor to engaging in this practice, as he explains. I guess bottoming for me has never been super comfortable. I mean, I've always enjoyed it, but there's always been an element of discomfort. And I guess GHB and amyl are both things that relieve that. Yeah, so amyl is something I have pretty often during sex to take that discomfort, to minimize it as much as I can. Like, I don't need it, it's just a tool. Yeah, I guess is how I'd look at it. I mean, I have plenty of sex without amyl. These accounts of drug-enhanced sexual pleasures resonate with popular media depictions of chemsex, although without the negative undertones often present in popular representations. Our participants' accounts suggest that popular depictions, with their emphasis on risks and harms, are rather one-dimensional. They disavow the possibility that sexualized drug use, though of course not without risks, can actually contribute to sexual pleasure, intimacy, and connection. And our colleagues working on the Crystal Pleasures project at UNSW have made a similar point in relation to gay and bisexual men's crystal meth use. Of course, our aim here is not to erase or diminish the struggles and difficulties that some encounter, and it's important to stress this. Rather, we wish to offer a more balanced account that situates consumption, its risks and rewards, in the context of our participants' diverse priorities and experiences. Our attention to the beneficial aspects of consumption is a response to the disproportionate emphasis on risks and harms in many popular scientific and public health discourses, which I know Bryant et al. In a recent article have described as the rush to risk. So in contrast to these dominant framings, our participants' accounts emphasize the generative effects of drugs, and in so doing challenge the negative connotations of sexualized drug use. So turning now to the second theme that we'll explore today, this is drugs in the making of gender. Particularly valued for some LGBTQ consumers was the capacity of particular drugs to transform bodily experience and the gender itself. And as you might expect, this was especially striking for some trans and gender diverse participants, and we got a good number of trans and gender diverse participants, more than we expected, in fact. These participants described how consuming their preferred drug or drugs allows them to experience their bodies in transformative ways, and often in ways that enable self-acceptance and enhance the experience of sex. So for example, Mira, a queer trans woman, commented on her experiences with LSD in these terms. She says, LSD is good because the times I've had sex on LSD, I've lost a certain level of spatial awareness. So I kind of forget I have a body, which is a very interesting experience. But I've also had hallucinatory experiences on LSD, mimicking a mental perception of, like PIV, penetrative sex, which is something that obviously really appeals to me. And that has been a very interesting experience. And again, that ties back into using drugs to reduce gender dysphoria and like coming to terms with things. And I just want to note here that Mira's account draws on the medicalized language of gender dysphoria. And we recognize this is one of the limited options in medical and popular discourses for trans and gender diverse people to articulate their experiences. So in presenting this account, we recognize that the category of gender dysphoria is not unproblematic and does not simply describe a self-evident reality. Indeed, it doesn't articulate with many of the diverse experiences of trans and gender diverse people. Some trans scholars have critiqued the medicalization of trans experience and the use of terms such as gender dysphoria. Nonetheless, some of our participants use this kind of language to articulate their experiences, and accounts like Mira's provide important examples where drugs were described as what we might call salves for coping with pain and marginalisation, as well as producing the pleasure of new possibilities and self-conceptions. So as mentioned, many of our participants described the generative potential of particular drugs to transform bodily experience and the gender itself. They valued these drug-related effects. So for example, Nico, a 40-year-old non-binary transmasculine participant, describes the gender-affirming effects of ecstasy in these terms. They say, so I had started questioning my gender, and then I was so scared of what was coming up for me. And then I went out with a friend one night. We did ecstasy and I was dancing. And I had this extremely vivid, like visual and felt sense of myself as this man. And just to note, Nico identifies as transmasculine for context. Just all of the physical characteristics. And it felt so real, and it was such a profoundly affirming experience for me. So for many of our participants, and Nico's a good example, experiences with drug use effectively produce them as different kinds of subjects, transforming them from a member of a marginalized group to an agentive, desiring sexual subject. It is in this sense that we argue that drugs function as technologies of the self, They have the potential, though this is not predictable or determining, but the potential to generate new, otherwise inaccessible subjectivities for queer consumers. It's important, though, to stress that the role of drugs in shaping or reshaping gender was by no means confined to the gender diverse people we interviewed. A number of cisgendered participants, often gay cis men, described how consumption facilitated gender play, allowing them to experiment with liberatory forms of gender transgression. Dane offers a particularly rich account of gender play involving drugs that captures the ludic social dimensions of these activities. We're constantly using drugs to entertain one another and perform and kind of be silly. We will, for instance, maybe have some crystal, take some caps, and go dancing, and just kind of have the best time, like doing a show for one another. Most of us are putting on drag. I think we're all willing to push the boundaries of what is socially acceptable. And I think that's what brings us together as friends. And these drugs definitely are a big part of that. Imminent in this example is the role of gender experimentation and transgression, or what Dane calls pushing the boundaries of what is socially acceptable in queer social scenes. Here, gender experimentation and transgression help to cement friendships and social bonds. The illicit taboo status of drugs emerges as an important part of the assemblage or phenomenon of gender transgression here. The consumption of drugs, together with non-normative forms of gender expression and the thrill of indulging in ludic conduct, generate novel forms of sociality and connections. These forms of sociality and connections exceed the prescriptive confines of heteronormative gender binaries. Echoing Dane's account, Avery, another gay cis male participant, describes the potential of MDMA to facilitate gender play and exploration, and I was quite taken with this account. I would say MDMA has helped shape the way I feel about gender. I started doing drag about 3 years ago, and I don't ever perform on any drugs, but I'd say that the community that I meet in a space where I tend to take MDMA has opened my eyes to a broader spectrum of gender and to broader options of experimentation and playfulness with gender than the outside world, outside of the pink bubble of the queer nightclub. I think I've been on a bit of a journey with my own gender, and I've experimented with more feminine manifestations in the real world because of the way that I've felt in these spaces. So while Avery describes the dynamics of MDMA and gender play in the context of queer social scenes and drag performances, he notes that these experiences have prompted him to explore non-normative gender expression outside what he calls, and I like this expression, the pink bubble of queer scenes. This, I think it's very poignant. This suggests that the effects of drugs are not limited to the specific temporal and physical contexts in which they are consumed, but ramify through to other domains of everyday life. So, turning towards some discussion and reflections as I begin to conclude, this presentation has tracked some of the ways in which drug consumption shapes queer identities and cultures. I've tried to do so without reifying drugs and their effects as fixed. I hope that has been clear. Instead, the analysis has sought to explore the sensory and affective pleasures that drugs afford in the context of sex, sociability, and intimacy. In doing so, we've queried normative tropes of pathology, trauma, and stigma that are often presented as drivers of LGBTQ drug use. Underwriting these explanatory frames is a view of drugs as intrinsically harmful and corrosive, a source of inevitable decline. This echoes a kind of familiar rock bottom narrative, addiction narrative. Following other scholars, we suggest that the prevailing view of LGBTQ drug use as inherently problematic articulates a form of moralism that seeks to, and I quote from you here, that seeks to disassociate queer sexualities from culturally undesirable practices such as promiscuity, drag, sex work, and drug use. Not only does this moralism and this kind of perspective strip LGBTQ drug use of its specificity and complexity, it forecloses the possibility that drug consumption can actually produce particular pleasures and benefits, hence its appeal to many. So as the accounts presented here show, the desire to alter bodily experience, increase pleasure, and enhance intimacy and sexual connection are key reasons why many LGBTQ people are attracted to drug use. For a number of our gender diverse participants, the experience of drug consumption was transformative insofar as it aligned their sense of self with their gendered body. For many of our participants, experiences with drug use effectively produced them as different kinds of subjects. And it's in this sense, as I mentioned earlier, that we argue that drugs function as technologies of the self, following Foucault. Drugs have the potential to help generate new and otherwise inaccessible subjectivities for queer consumers. So building on this understanding, we see drug consumption as one practice among many that helps to build queer cultures and identities, rather than threatening only to erode them. So I'll end with some implications for policy and practice by way of conclusion. Our participants' accounts, as I've mentioned, highlight LGBTQ people's varied motivations for consuming drugs. And I've only been able to capture some of these in this brief presentation. These motivations cannot be understood solely through familiar paradigms that use explanatory frames of marginalisation, stigma, and discrimination to account for LGBTQ consumption. We suggest that research in health services would be improved by acknowledging the rewards and pleasures of drug use, as well as its potential risks and harms. And importantly, by addressing the role of drug use in contributing to queer communities and cultures. And this is an approach that I know underpins much of ARCSHS research, but that I don't think is widely applied in much of the research, particularly within public health, on LGBTQ communities. However, it's noteworthy that LGBTQ organisations in the jurisdictions covered in this study already have a number of innovative projects, and these are built on consumers' embodied experiences. They address the pleasures, benefits, and transformative potential and value of drug use, alongside its potential risks and harms. So they're not neglecting the risks and harms, but they're seeking to address the pleasures and benefits as well. And you may be aware of these programs, but for those of you who aren't, they include the ACON Rovers program in New South Wales, and there's an excellent paper that analyses that program published in the Contemporary Journal, Contemporary Drug Problems Journal. I'd be happy to pass on that link if anyone's interested. Also, Thorn Harbour Health's outreach program and Harm Reduction Victoria's DanceWise. So those are just a few that I want to highlight. By incorporating the experiential knowledge of community volunteers and peer support models, these initiatives exemplify practical harm reduction measures developed from below, or better still, maybe from within, if we want to avoid that kind of hierarchy of knowledge. Importantly, they evidence a sensitivity to the dynamics of queer cultural scenes and an attentiveness to what Gonsalves et al., and that's the paper I mentioned, published in Contemporary Drug Problems, they evidence an attentiveness to what Gonsalves et al. Have called the social pragmatics of pleasure and the logics of care already at work in these settings. Working within a pleasure-positive harm reduction framework and using approaches designed and delivered by peers, these interventions are framed in terms that resonate with LGBTQ consumers. And I think that's really important. Because if the interventions we propose or the organisations propose are not consistent or don't resonate with consumers, they're likely to be alienating and they may not have the uptake that is hoped for. So in short then, and in line with the innovative initiatives of Australian LGBTQ organisations, we advocate for what Faye Dennis has called a more than harm reduction approach. And I'm delighted that Faye is joining us Zooming in today. Thanks, Faye. So as its name suggests, the more than harm reduction approach entails moving beyond a narrow focus on harm reduction. It asks what might emerge if we supplemented, crucially supplemented and not replaced, existing harm reduction efforts with initiatives oriented to enhancing pleasure and optimizing the benefits that drug use can afford. Implicit here is a paradigm shift in which drug consumption is treated as a matter of care rather than one of concern. And we're drawing on the work of, I'm going to massacre her name, but it's Puig de la Bella Casa, to conceptualize matters of care. We are proposing, in other words, a paradigm shift that prioritizes care over managing risk and minimizing harm. In proposing an ethos of care, we're not suggesting adopting a paternalism that reinforces a view of people who consume drugs as damaged and in need of protection. Rather, we are arguing for an approach that recognizes and values the agency of consumers, their experiential knowledge, and the logics of care already at work in LGBTQ cultures. And this kind of approach, I think, resonates with the work of colleagues at ARCSHS. They've done a terrific project in relation to naloxone and looking at the care practices in those contexts amongst peers delivering naloxone. So it's consistent with that approach. We ask, what would it mean to treat pleasure, the exercise of bodies and their desires, as matters of care? That is, as things that are cared for and cared about in various ways. And I think care also invokes a sense of concern has a kind of a separateness, whereas care, I think you can care about something in a way that suggests you're intimately entangled with it rather than concerned about it, for me, there's a level of distance that's implied by concern that is not implied by care. So engaging people in terms that resonate with their experiences of drug use and the desires that animate them is to treat drug use as a matter of care. Crucially, the language of care we are proposing is not merely an epistemological discursive issue. As STS and feminist science studies scholars, including colleagues at ARCSHS, have long argued, our ways of researching phenomena and the terms we use to present them have, to use a term that Moll uses, Anne-Marie Moll, these ways of researching phenomena have world-making effects. As Faye Dennis puts it, research is, and I quote, a hands-on practice of maintaining worlds. And as such, we have an ethical responsibility to the worlds we build and those we foreclose through particular knowledge-making and thus world-making practices. So, guided by this ethical sensibility, we can produce more capacious realities attuned to the generative capacities of drug use. And these are some of the key references on which this work draws. The full list is included in the paper that forms the basis of the presentation, which I'm happy to pass on. There are many references. I struggled to select the key ones, but here they are. And thank you all for your attention. I am conscious that it's quite challenging to listen in via Zoom, and I'm grateful to you all for zooming in. I've included the details of the project website here in case you'd like to find out more about the study, and my contact details if you'd like to get in touch. And thank you to Renee for facilitating this.
Oh, everyone is joining me from their bedrooms or lounge rooms and giving you a raised hand or a round of applause. There's lots of raised hands going up, Kiran, if you can't see them. Yeah, oh, that was such a wonderful presentation, and I'd encourage if anyone has any questions right now to pop it on in the Q&A, and I can put them to Kiran, or if you'd like to be unmuted, which is a feature of the webinar, I can unmute you if you'd just like to talk and figure out your question as you go along. Yeah, I just wanted to say it was, to borrow your term of phrase, Kiran, it was a salve for the soul to see all that rich data that you've got, and you know, just to see your analysis and your findings, to say the things we all know but never get to read about as drug researchers, you know, that of course drug using practices are about the self and indulgence and pleasure and connection and play and meaning and tinkering with the self. And I really, as I was listening to you, felt such relief, because it's very rare, you know, a lot of the time, even though that's what we know goes on, a lot of the time we don't get to hear about it. So that was really excellent. I have a question, but it looks like a question has come up. So that's Tony. Can you see them, Kiran, or should I read them to you?
I'm just figuring out, I think, on this.
So Tony has said, super interesting. There's a lot of debate about the ban on AML, and in light of your findings, is a ban on AML an example of a public health intervention or the government effectively shutting down pleasure experienced by LGBTQ communities?
Thanks, Tony. That's a great question. I think you can probably guess what my response is. I think that it's unlikely to be effective, and we know that prohibitionist drug policies have limited effectiveness and they produce many of the harms that are attributed to drugs. So I would say that a ban on AML is not an effective public health intervention and is going against the kind of work and our findings that would advocate for a more open approach to drug use, to legalizing illicit drugs. And yeah, I don't think it would have the effects that the public health officials who are proposing it envisage. I think it would actually, as we know, as many critical drugs researchers know, prohibitionist drug policies drive drug use underground, and they produce a range of harms that could be avoided if illicit drugs were regulated in the same way that pharmaceuticals or illicit drugs are. I hope that answers your question. It's so hard because I can't see anyone, but feel free to follow up if it doesn't.
Kamal, I hope I've pronounced your name right, has said, quick question, was age a factor in terms of motivation of using drugs in LGBT plus communities?
So Kamal, we didn't look at that specifically. I guess our interest wasn't necessarily in kind of trying to draw correlations between particular demographic variables, so age and gender, and specific drug using practices. I would have to return to the data and kind of apply that question to it to do justice to your question. But as you can see from the age range that we got, it's not as though participants at a particular age stopped using drugs. Of course, their drug use would have changed over time. That wasn't a particular focus of our study though. But as you would guess from the 75-year-old participant, drug use was still an important part of their experience of sociality and their sexuality. I didn't include any quotes from that participant, unfortunately.
I actually had my question was actually about that, and about with the older participants. I really loved the term you used throughout around people creating sexual architectures and also playing around with temporalities. And I was wondering if there was anything noticeable about, you know, older participants playing around with sexual architectures, because I mean, of course, connection and intimacy are also relevant to older people using drugs and having sex, but I just imagine there might be other concerns or practices or something around aging and bodies, and yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting question to explore. I have to be quite frank that we haven't looked at it in the terms that you proposed, but I suppose there's so many different ways in which you can look at the data, and age might be one lens that you'd apply to it and see, well, does that affect people's experiences? And that might yield new insights that we haven't looked at.
Yeah.
I guess the focus of this paper, because it's one of the first used using the interview data, was to kind of look more broadly at the role of drug use in shaping gender and sexuality across ages. So not trying to correlate any particular experiences with age or other variables.
I didn't mean like to be like, you know, older people in this age bracket have these.
Yeah.
There might be something interesting about aging, but
yes, I think you're right. I think that would be an interesting thing to explore. It's an interesting avenue for further research. Thanks, Renee, or for a future paper. Maybe one of my colleagues would like to explore that.
I'm sure there'll be lots of people with who would love to be looking at this data. It's so rich. I have a question from Isabel, who has told me not to read this out loud, but she's a PhD student from ANU, wondering how you think theory of technologies of the self may be applied to cigarette smoking in queer women's communities. Isabel thinks this poses a particularly interesting conundrum, as smoking tobacco does not necessarily, chemically anyway, elicit a transformative experience, although it may indeed do so in other ways. Was smoking a part of the data at all?
Oh, thank you, Isabel. That's a really rich question. And excuse me for looking at my other screen. I've got the questions on that screen and I'm too scared to move them across in case I've used them. I'm just reading it again. I think that an important thing to mention is that we're not confining our accounts to what you might call psychoactive effects of drugs. So the fact that smoking tobacco doesn't necessarily produce, or arguably doesn't produce, a chemical or psychoactive effect, I think it certainly might generate other effects. And one of the things that many of the gay cis men we spoke to talked about was the pleasures produced in smoking crystal meth. So I can't really comment on cigarette smoking in queer women's communities because that didn't emerge in our data, although there were a few participants who talked about the pleasures of smoking, either as a kind of, how would you describe it, like after sex, that kind of post-orgasm elated feeling, and then smoking being part of that pleasure and extending the pleasure. But certainly for the gay cis men, they talked about the intensity of smoking crystal meth, and they contrasted it with blasting, and they talked about the importance of the mode of administering the drug in terms of the kind of the effects that they desired. So I don't know if I hope that answers your question, but we haven't looked in particular at cigarette smoking in queer women's.
From ANU most probably Isabel is a PhD student at ANU, knows of Helen's work, has written around smoking.
Yes, I would encourage you, Isabel. I'm sure you're familiar with Helen's work, but that I did think of Helen's excellent work on smoking that might be relevant and might answer your question in more concrete terms.
We also have a question from Gemma, who says, "Hi Kiran, thanks so much. I'm interested in whether an awareness of harm discourses was reflected in any of the interview material. Were people describing these lovely, pleasurable, expansive drug realities in explicit contrast to a harm or risk discourse, or were discussions of risk and harm threaded throughout people's accounts? Thanks again."
Thank you. Thanks, Gemma. That's a really excellent question, and I'm glad you raised it, because I think one thing to flag is that we don't want to imply that we're minimizing the risks and harms, or that participants didn't experience any risks or harms. You're right, and you put it really beautifully. The accounts of risks and harms were threaded through the interviews, not in all cases, but there were some participants who'd had very adverse effects. Some had experienced psychosis, some had I guess they drew on the kind of classic addiction narrative of ruin and redemption. And one thing that we've tried to do in this paper is focus on some of the pleasures and benefits. But I guess that, of course, that does raise the question of, what harms did people experience? And I think an area that we're keen to explore, certainly I'm keen to explore, is participants' accounts of harm, but also how they manage the risks and harms. Because what was interesting is when participants realized that our approach to conducting this research was quite different from, say, mainstream public health or psych type surveys, and that we were open to the pleasures and benefits of drug use, and we were keen to encourage a more expansive, richer, fuller account. That gave them, I guess, almost permission, if you like, to talk about and emphasize the pleasures and benefits. But those who did talk about risks and harms, we asked them specifically to tell us about how they've managed those. And I think that doesn't always come out in interviews, and that's an artifact, I would suggest, of the research process, where perhaps the interviewer or the survey instrument doesn't allow for participants or for the researchers to explore how participants manage risks and harms. So I think one thing that we're keen to look at is what are the logics of care that participants put in place or have in place around their drug use, and how do they minimize risks and harms. And certainly in some cases, participants did draw on treatment programs. Some of them were involved in Thorn Harbour Health's Rewired program to reduce their crystal meth use. A lot of them, though, talked about not wanting to abstain from drug use, so abstinence for many of them wasn't seen as viable or desirable, and instead they were keen to reduce harms by minimizing use or cutting back, or organizing their use around particular events or around their work. So those are some of the strategies and what we've called logics of care that we're keen to tease out and explore in relation to participants' experiences of the risks and harms of drugs alongside pleasures and benefits.
Thanks, Kiran. Nathaniel Wells said, beautiful presentation. Thank you. I really feel like I'm getting the character of each person in my my performance of all of these questions. So I hope everyone else thinks, oh, beautiful presentation. Thank you. You spoke of Avery, who had discomfort bottoming, and Amel was a way to get over this, and later of drugs as a way. Was his discomfort physical, psychological, is one question, and was there a sense of drugs facilitating transgressing gender boundaries sexually?
Okay, in relation to Avery, I'd need to go look back, and that's a good question, thanks Nathan. I'd need to go back and look at his transcript, but I suppose one thing that I would say up front is that I would be very cautious of assigning my kind of interpretation of the discomfort, whether it was physical or psychological. I can only describe what he reported, and my sense from the transcript is that he was reporting physical discomfort rather than psychological, but the extent to which those divisions hold and make sense for his experience are also, I guess, a bit blurry. And sorry, the second bit was there a sense of drugs facilitating transgressing gender boundaries?
Speak about, Kiran, in your presentation, the transgression and shaping of gender norms.
Yes, certainly. I think I covered that in the second part. Yeah, where looking at drugs and the making of gender, and we looked at some of the cis male participants' experiences, the gay cis men, and how using particular drugs, or their experience of being part of a queer sexualized drug using scene, if you like, enabled them to put on drag, to transgress gender binaries and perform alternative forms of gender, kind of transgressive forms, if you like. I hope that answers your question.
I know we're just hitting 5, but there's just a couple more questions. And also I can see that a couple of people have their hands up, and like Faye, Emily and Stephen. I don't know if you want to ask questions or your hands are just up, but you can let me know while I ask out the next question. Nicholas Robertson Griffiths has said, very interesting. I appreciate challenging the notion of the traumatized queer, quote unquote, as related to drug use. However, in so many ways, I see a trauma-informed lens as being necessary in order to satisfy the ideas of the deserving and justify the need for treatment, and at times access to funding. I worry about this and implications for LGBTQ service provision if we move to a pleasure or enjoyment model of illicit substances. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Thank you, Nicholas. That's a really excellent question, and it goes to the politics, I suppose, of what we're proposing in moving beyond harm reduction, because already in adopting a harm reduction approach, that's a particular political move which has implications. And I appreciate what you're saying about using a trauma-informed lens as being necessary to satisfy the ideas of the deserving. But I guess I would add to that, though, that perhaps we need to also consider what some of the unintended and damaging deleterious effects of that lens are on LGBTQ people and the construction of them as being, as having these deficits or, and how it might reinforce stigma and marginality. And I think I would argue that while it's important to be able to justify the need for funding, a kind of broader critical focus on what particular problematizations do for the communities that are framed in those terms is equally important. And yeah, I guess it would be a tricky juggling act, and I appreciate that, of course, in proposing this kind of more than harm reduction approach and focusing on pleasures and benefits, we wouldn't at all want to be minimizing or suggesting that funding gets cut, or that the harm reduction programs and other treatment programs already in place are not justified and not valued. I think there's evidence to suggest they certainly are, and we know that many people are waiting, the lists for treatment or waiting lists for treatment are long. So yeah, I would say I'd advocate for obviously proceeding with caution and with awareness of the politics of whatever approach we're advocating for. But in this case, I think an important thing that perhaps the kind of trauma lens doesn't really consider is how it enacts or constitutes LGBTQ people in ways that reinforce stigma and marginalisation. And I think those are equally important concerns that we need to weigh up in terms of in how we frame the problem or the issues, and how those shape the communities that are affected. I hope that answers your question.
It's 5:03, but there's just one final question up there. Gemma Norse has snuck in a sneaky second question, so we'll just answer this and we'll finish after this question. Gemma's just wondering whether or not PEDS, performance and image enhancing drugs, came up in this data at all, and if so, in what ways?
That's a good question, Gemma. I'm struggling to remember now. I feel as though I want to say it didn't, but I feel like it must have in some form. But if it did, it certainly wasn't a prominent focus. And I think one thing we would need to do is ensure that we code the data to capture any references to PEDS and to see how they were significant and perhaps how they differ from other drugs. Dean might be able to correct me because he's closer to the data than I am, but my feeling is that that wasn't a major issue. I seem to recall we had difficulty, and I know that Renee can attest to this too from their study, attracting people who use performance and image enhancing drugs. So that might explain why it didn't come up as a prominent concern among the gay cis men that we interviewed.
Although, I mean, it's interesting because I imagine a lot of people, not a lot, but I imagine some of your participants would have been injecting testosterone or using hormones, but in this category, the exact same substance wouldn't be considered performance or image enhancing in that way, which just points to the kind of weakness of that category. As you've
said that, Renee, that makes me think. I was thinking of it in quite limited narrow terms. So in a more expansive sense, I would need to return to the data and look at it as you framed it in a more capacious, generous way.
Yeah, or just how limited that category, what is the category really doing? Because actually a lot of what your participants are talking about is performance and image enhancement. So either, so it kind of messes with the boundaries, or what the criteria upon which those categories are built needs some further interrogation, which I think Gemma is doing a PhD on this very thing. So hopefully.
Terrific. We'll watch this space, Gemma.
Anyway, I hope everyone can raise a virtual hand for Kiran's presentation. There's many a virtual hand raising, Kiran. It was really excellent. Thank you so much for helping us step through the ARCSHS seminar in webinar form. I think we did quite well. There was no major technological hiccup. So thank you so much. Your presentation was excellent, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Our next seminar is on June 17th, and we have Juliet Watson speaking about gendered experiences of homelessness. If you'd like to get put on the mailing list, please email me or you'll see it on Twitter. But yeah, thank you so much, Kiran. It's been really excellent, and thank you everyone for coming. Everyone, if you can see the comment threads saying that your presentation was amazing, and I very much agree.
Thank you, Renee. Thanks for facilitating it, and thank you all for zooming in from various corners of the world. I can't see you, but hi and thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great Wednesday night. Hey, are we going to zoom out now, Kiran, or hang around while everyone else?
Should we stop recording it so that you've got a nice tight recording?
Stop
I don't know.